Getting from last place to winning a race is an impressive feat for any driver in any category. In the case of Formula One, this is an even rarer occurrence. Only on 6 occasions has a driver who started last managed to climb the grid to victory, and in one of those instances, the win was achieved through cheating. With little race time and an entire grid to overcome, only 4 drivers have been capable of such a feat, usually due to track conditions. As always, let's establish the criteria first. To compile this list, 2 objective criteria were considered. Firstly, we must consider only cases where the driver started exactly from the last position to finish first. With that in mind, we can consider all cases where a driver either started last or fell to last during the Grand Prix. With this condition highlighted, only 6 races qualify to appear here on the list, but there's a detail. One of the races was the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, where Fernando Alonso won after falling to last. The driver was the first to make his pit stop, and 2 laps later, his teammate Nelsino Piquet had an accident. It was later discovered that the crash was staged to favor the Spaniard, but by then, it was too late to change the results. Due to the trickery, Alonso's victory will not be considered on the list. Secondly, we will consider the lap on which the driver was last. The reason is simple. A driver starting from the last position has an entire race ahead to recover and compete for victory. A driver who spins, crashes, or makes a pit stop in the middle of the race does not. Although both are incredible cases, the victory of a driver who was last in the middle of the race ends up being more impressive than one who started last. With all considerations made, here's the list. The 2020 Sakir GP was Sergio Perez's first victory in Formula One and the first victory for a Mexican since Pedro Rodriguez in 1970. In the first lap, Charles Leclerc made a mistake and hit Perez's car, causing the driver to spin and drop to last. With the yellow flag active, the Mexican anticipated one of his pit stops without needing to distance himself from the rest of the grid. When the race resumed on lap 7, Perez not only managed to stay with the pack but also developed a strong race pace, climbing the grid to the front group. On lap 63, Jack Aitken's crash brought the safety car back onto the track, and during the pit stops, Mercedes made mistakes in both George Russell and Valtteri Bottas's pit stops, opening the way for Perez. At that point in the race, the Mexican was already in first place after overtaking Esteban Ocon of Renault and his teammate Lance Stroll. In the final laps, Russell was recovering and threatening Perez, but a tire puncture ended the Mercedes driver's chances. Without the danger from Russell and with a better pace than Ocon, Perez won after a great recovery race on dry track conditions, further enhancing the value of his victory. In 2003, F1 decided to use a single lap format in the qualifying session, and David Coulthard ended up starting 11th in the Australian Grand Prix. On race day, the track was still damp due to rain that fell hours earlier, and the entire grid started on intermediate tires. At the start, Michael Schumacher maintained the lead, followed by Rubens Barrichello and Juan Pablo Montoya. By the end of the first lap, Coulthard decided to take a gamble and entered the pits to change the intermediate tires for dry tires. In the following laps, the track dried up, and consequently, the intermediate tires began to wear out more. The rest of the grid began to change tires, but Ferrari took longer to call its drivers in. Barrichello received a penalty, and upon exiting the pits, he lost control and crashed. Ralph Furman crashed his Jordan, and Cristiano da Mata spun. The safety car entered the track, and some drivers took advantage to make their stops. At this point, Coulthard was setting fast laps and was already in 8th place with warmed-up tires. Raikkonen, who had led the race, had to serve a penalty for speeding in the pits and dropped out of contention. Schumacher also had problems, and the German had to make an extra stop due to damage to the floor. By lap 47, the Scotsman was in 2nd place and chasing Montoya, and at the beginning of the next lap, the Colombian spun out. Raikkonen, who was in 3rd, managed to get close to the Williams but couldn't overtake. Without major issues, Coulthard won the race, which was marked as his last victory in his F1 career. Jenson Button's first victory at McLaren was filled with excitement. After a poor performance in Bahrain, the British driver achieved a better result in the qualifying session of the Australian GP, qualifying in 4th place. In the first corner, Fernando Alonso spun on the slippery track, triggering chaos that dropped Button to 6th. The safety car entered the track and remained until lap 4, and Hamilton overtook his teammate for 6th place 2 laps later. At the end of lap 7, Button decided to pit and put on dry tires, imagining that the track conditions would change quickly. On the first lap with the new tires, the British driver went off track twice and ended up dropping to 19th, which at that moment was the last position. Despite the problems, his prediction proved to be the most accurate, and in no time, he was the fastest car on the track. With conditions improving fast, it took only 3 laps for the rest of the grid to realize that slicks were the correct choice, and Button had already taken second place on lap 11. His last opponent was Sebastian Vettel of Red Bull, who remained in the lead until lap 25. On the next lap, a problem with the front brake caused the German to spin at the Ascari corner, retiring from the race. The lead fell into Button's lap, who remained trouble-free in the lead until the end of the race. In the early laps of the 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix, Giancarlo Fisichella was called for a pit stop. Betting on the chaos caused by the relentless rain, the Jordan team called their drivers to refuel, imagining that the race could end prematurely. At that moment, the Italian was in 8th place, and with the procedure, he ended up at the back of the grid, ahead only of Firman. About 10 laps after the pit stops, his teammates suffered a suspension problem that caused him to spin and hit Olivier Panis's Toyota. With the accident, Fisichella's 16th position became the last. With great skill, the Italian drove amidst the storm that claimed victims throughout the grid, and the early refueling began to pay off. By the end of lap 54, the Jordan driver had overtaken leader Kimi Räikkönen to take the lead. At that moment, Mark Webber of Jaguar spun and crashed heavily on the pit straight, spreading a large amount of dirt, debris, and tires from the barrier. As if the impact wasn't enough, Fernando Alonso couldn't avoid one of Webber's tires and destroyed his Renault against the inner tire barrier. With another car spreading debris and even more tires scattered across the track, the race director was forced to end the race. In the confusion, victory was given to Räikkönen, who was leading the race on lap 53. After an analysis of the results, the FIA reversed its decision and understood that Fisichella had led a full lap, the number 54. With the change, the Italian was declared the winner and received the trophy 7 days later at the Imola circuit. The longest race in F1 history was the setting for Button's most famous victory. After making a mistake that caused his teammate Hamilton to crash, the Briton went to the pits and changed from wet tires to intermediates. Shortly after, the driver received a drive-through penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Dropping to 15th place, the race was then stopped for 2 hours due to heavy rain. After the restart, Button regained some positions, and when he was in 9th, he decided to change from wet tires to intermediates. The already compromised race became even more so a lap later. In an attempt to overtake Alonso, Button had one of his tires punctured, forcing the driver to return to the pits. The almost consecutive 2 stops pushed Button to the last position around the halfway point of the race. Taking advantage of the drying track, the Briton, who by this time had little to lose, decided to gamble on slick tires. The gamble paid off so well that 20 laps later, Button was again among the frontrunners, in 4th place. After overtaking Mark Webber and Michael Schumacher, the driver was now chasing Sebastian Vettel, who had been leading the race with a comfortable margin. In the final laps, Button erased the entire advantage of the Red Bull driver and put pressure on Vettel until the last lap, when the German made a mistake. Vettel's off-track excursion was quick, but was enough for Button to take the lead and complete the last meters of the race in 1st place. If you enjoyed the video and want more information about Formula 1, IndyCar, and others, subscribe to the channel. Questions, suggestions, or tips are always welcome. Leave them in the comments below. Until next time.